Hi, this is Helen Kelly with DMA, and this is the Move On Strategy module, which is your general overview for the Eastern PA CoC. In this particular module, we're going to define what is meant by move on, and it's really meant to guide you as the participants in developing or strengthening a culture and permanent supportive housing and the homeless assistance system that is supportive of moving on principles and values, including tenant choice and a focus on long-term stability and success. This is a high-level overview, so deeper dives on the concepts explored in the following slides are found in other topic-specific or audience-specific webinars that are also available on your CoC website. First up are the moving on basics. With this slide, we just want to establish what we mean by certain terms so everyone is on the same page. And the first definition, where the first term actually has two different definitions, the continuum of care first can mean a local planning body responsible for coordinating the full range of homeless services in a geographic area. And that can cover a city, a county, a metropolitan area, or even an entire state. In your case, the Eastern Pennsylvania CoC covers 33 counties in Eastern and Central Pennsylvania. The other definition of a CoC would be a HUD funding source dedicated to addressing homelessness. And the next term we have, permanent supportive housing, or PSH, is actually largely funded usually by this CoC HUD funding source. And that is non-time limited housing, which can be site-based or tenant-based, that's paired with supportive services to assist individuals or families who are experiencing homelessness and help them achieve housing stability. PSH requires that at least one member of the household has a disability, and then there's also that chronic designation that's required in the Eastern Pennsylvania CoC. Okay, then we have this term moving on, which this is obviously part of a whole moving on strategy for your CoC. And when we say moving on, that's a program that assists tenants who are ready and wish to leave PSH by connecting them with affordable housing and financial assistance and transition supports. And so essentially these are services to help tenants prepare for, navigate, and adjust to their transition out of PSH. So typically they just no longer need those intensive services that are really characteristic of PSH. They might only need the affordable housing piece of it, which can be found out in the regular marketplace or with a housing choice voucher and things of that nature. The last definition that we just want to establish for everyone is the Public Housing Authority, or PHA, and a state, county, municipality, or other governmental entity or public body authorized under state law to administer a housing or rental assistance program would be the definition of a PHA. In your CoC, you have 39 PHAs. Some of your counties, for example, Wayne and Pike, share a PHA, and then in other instances there are multiple PHAs within one county. So you'll see how PHAs are dispersed throughout your CoC really kind of be differentiated depending on which county you're looking at out of your 33. Now here we're really just building on the definition of moving on that we just saw. And moving on programs connect tenants with affordable housing and other financial resources and provide transition supports for success post PSH for long-term stability. The primary goals of moving on are to support independence and choice for those no longer requiring the intensive supportive services associated with PSH, and to free up units and create capacity in PSH for people experiencing homelessness who would benefit from intensive long-term services and rental support. There are a few guiding principles that we're going to look at on the next few slides, and one is that it really needs to be voluntary. Tenants can stay in PSH as long as they want to. Remember, it's non-time limited, and they can remain eligible for PSH that entire time. They can also remain eligible for moving on. So participation in move on should be optional and voluntary. Collaboration is another huge guiding principle. To be successful, move on strategies require commitments from mainstream housing and service agencies and a really close collaboration between CoCs and PSH providers, along with those community partners. So we have, the CoC and PSH provider on one side and then the community partners on the other, and really just working together. And this is to help PSH tenants connect to these supports, will ensure long-term stability in their housing. Related to that, there needs to be really robust transition supports. Tenants who are ready to move on are stable and independent, but typically still want and need affordable housing and financial assistance to help with the security deposit and other transition costs. And services might be needed to help them navigate the transition period as they get ready to move on and adjust to their new living situation. That said, they might also be transitioning in place. They may not necessarily be moving into a new unit, but perhaps they have to get accustomed to other things now without having that one specific case manager that's their single point of contact. Okay, there's a couple of core components of a move-on strategy, and that is, for one, sustainable, affordable housing. And so that means post-PSH that the individual has access to affordable housing, such as a housing choice voucher or a public housing unit from a housing authority, a unit in a HUD multifamily property perhaps, or a unit in another kind of affordable housing building or with some kind of subsidy. So that might be a LIHTC property. It might be a unit in the community that has been subsidized by reinvestment dollars. The availability of these miscellaneous type units are really going to depend on the community that is implementing the move-on strategy. And we've mentioned transition supports a few times now, but they are going to help with applying for the housing subsidy, housing navigation if the person is not transitioning in place, budget and credit building, repair assistance, and logistical and mental preparation for the transition. And then the follow-up services once the tenant moves or moves on from PSH. Now, note that some of this really can be happening and should be happening within the PSH program, but we just want to have it here just to ensure that it is actually happening and that it doesn't get overlooked. And there should be some flexible financial resources, which could include funds for expenses such as the security deposit or housing application or background fees that's charged by landlords, perhaps furniture or a moving van or service, etc. You might also be able to see what services you might be able to leverage in your community. For example, in a community I used to work in, their local county jail had a work release program, and under supervision, those men and women were actually able to provide moving assistance to households that were moving from one unit to another. So that's something to look at as well when you're looking at flexible financial resources. What other resources do you have in the community which might be able to help support the individual moving on from PSH? Now, moving on is not without its challenges. There's a number of barriers. So there could be issues related to accessibility or eligibility of other affordable housing. The person who is in PSH, perhaps they have a criminal record that is precluding them from getting a housing choice voucher, and that really would be their best bet in terms of getting affordable housing post PSH. So there might be some issues along those lines. Some individuals, there could be a lack of awareness that moving on is an option. So if your community is offering move on as like part of like this comprehensive strategy, everyone in PSH really needs to know that that is an option at some point, and that's something that they might want to prepare for. There could be a lack of support to help a tenant's transition. And a lot of that sometimes can be around confusion around what the funding can or cannot fund once someone is done receiving permanent supportive housing supports. And so it's really important here to understand that although the subsidy for PSH, that financial, the rental assistance piece, although that could end, someone can still continue to get supportive services through that permanent supportive housing program for another couple of months, for about another 6 months or so. So that's really important to understand. Also, you might be able to look at blended case management or other case management resources in the community that might be better appropriate for that person as opposed to the really robust permanent supportive housing. So what that looks like in your community will kind of depend on the resources that's available and what's best for the individual. Another barrier is just fear of leaving PSH. This could be, what someone has become accustomed to over a couple of years. And although they may not need the level of support that comes with your PSH programs, there could still be that fear of change and kind of not having that safety net of the PSH program. And then, of course, the financial health of an individual, which this is like often tied in with the need for affordable housing that we talked about in the first point, but it's still a very real issue nonetheless of, someone's financial health. And even if they can get into a unit and they are eligible for a unit, can they actually have the resources on their own to support themselves in that unit? Now, we touched on this a little bit, but just to do a slightly deeper dive, we're going to look at some of the housing destinations for move-on tenants. So when you are creating a move-on strategy in your area, you're really going to want to see which ones of these units you have in your portfolio that you can tap into for individuals. Factors influencing the housing destination for a moving-on tenant include the resources available, their current living situation, because remember, they can potentially transition in place, their income, their preferences, and more. Potential destinations include transitioning in place, like I mentioned, with a new subsidy, moving to a private market unit, either with or without a subsidy, moving to a site-based affordable housing unit, one that is either subsidized or managed by the Public Housing Authority, multifamily property, LIHTC, things of that nature. Or perhaps the tenant moves into their own home, possibly supported by a home ownership program, which the Housing Authority might provide, as well as perhaps a community action agency in the area. It really all just depends, again, on the makeup of the services in your area. Since the Eastern Pennsylvania CoC is 33 counties long, the county is large, it's not possible within this training to kind of spell out all of the different services within the community. But these give you an idea of what you need to look at when you're looking to do move on in your area. So we looked at some challenges, but now let's look at some benefits, okay? Because the individual will have continued rental assistance, potentially, and housing stability. There can be increased privacy and independence, depending on how the PSH program was set up, and definitely privacy in that there likely will not be a case manager that is checking in with them at some set time. There could be an opportunity to grow and further pursue personal goals. Once someone has a rental subsidy, they might, especially if it's through the housing authority, they might be able to take that subsidy to a new town or a county or a state after 1 year, because they might be able to port that voucher to somewhere else. And there also is, with other types of subsidies, transitions and transfers that are allowed to happen as well. They can add other people to the household, which, while this might still happen in PSH from time to time, this can be done without, really having that extra layer of having the PSH program element in the mix, and it would just be between the person and their landlord. The individual will be able to move to a new unit, which could be good for them if they felt like they were just kind of in the unit that was available for PSH at that time. But in some cases, they might love their unit and it might suit them quite well, and in which case they might be able to transition in place. It really depends on how the PSH program is set up. And their supports to ensure or better ensure a successful transition. All right, so moving on is different than just maintaining the status quo. There's actually change that's happening at the systems, program, and individual level. And we're talking about some culture shifts that are happening. So at the systems level, PSH units become available to move households currently experiencing homelessness into housing. Maybe the rapid rehousing intervention is not really the most appropriate intervention for them. Perhaps they need something more robust. And then this allows that flow to happen where new people can move in. At the program level, tenants successfully exit the program for another permanent housing opportunity. So when you're doing those HMIS exit assessments, there's where they ask about the final destination. This is a successful, positive exit destination. And of course, more than just being able to check that off, it's the reality that someone was able to have a positive outcome. And then at the individual level, there's tenants that have more choices and they're able to thrive in some more independent settings. So why should you care about moving on? We go into some of these in a bit more detail in some of the more audience specific modules, whether you're a PSH provider or a housing authority. But generally for the PHAs or multifamily properties, other affordable housing operators out in the community, serving move-on clients will support your community's efforts to end homelessness while also providing you with stable tenants. Because remember, the tenants have already gone through the PSH program. They've already achieved housing stability for the most part. If someone is in a permanent supportive housing program, they have not experienced homelessness for quite some time. So they have a history of already paying rent and working with a landlord and potentially having neighbors and all of those things. The moving on program screening and assessment process, which we have another module on, will ensure that the referrals for the tenants are the ones that have demonstrated housing stability and have this track record of paying rent and utilities on time, and be able to live independently without the need for intensive services. So there's actually an assessment that will help indicate who might be most ready and most appropriate for moving on, which of course is coupled with their choice to do so. And a moving on initiative can help you reduce time to lease up and increase your utilization for housing choice vouchers, or quickly fill vacancies in public housing, because you'll have a list of tenants that are ready to go, essentially, that you don't necessarily need to track down or get a lot of documentation for, because they would have already had that completed with their housing case managers. And for those living in permanent supportive housing, it provides them more options and can help support tenants who wish to move on. All right, so let's say your community is on board. You really want to create a move-on strategy in your county or service region. And so how do you go about doing that? The next couple of slides are going to walk you through the different components that need to be in place to properly plan for a moving on strategy. We go into each of these in more detail, but there's your kind of community assessment and the pre-work that needs to go and happen. There's preparation after the pre-work. There's the transition supports that need to be in place, and then the aftercare supports or the post-PSH supports. That first stage of planning, we mentioned the assessment and pre-work. So this is what we mean by that. To identify a leadership team, to prepare an inventory of housing and other resources. More on that on another slide. To conduct a local assessment to inform the project design, including an identification of barriers. To develop some action steps, goals, and timelines, and to develop outcomes measures and goals. Again, more of this on other slides, and there are resources available to you to help you with this. So we just mentioned that there should be a leadership team, and depending on who's on this team will depend on the composition of the area or the county that will be doing this, but generally you're looking at perhaps CoC leadership. So do you have a RAB chair perhaps that might be appropriate for this, or someone else that is involved with the CoC? The public housing authorities, perhaps some unit of local government, permanent supportive housing providers, of course. We certainly want to see people with lived expertise at the table and with a voice. So current and former PSH tenants, perhaps affordable housing developers or owners or operators, community resources and different service providers. So looking at different perhaps types of case management that's in your community, potentially some funders. Maybe there's a foundation or a United Way in your area, and then of course landlords would be really beneficial, or a landlord association would be really a wise choice to have on your leadership team. So you are definitely also going to want to have MOUs in place. Not necessarily between like everyone. I mean, however many MOUs you want to have in your community is up to you, but essentially you're going to have one at least between the housing authority or other housing partner, whoever's going to kind of have the bulk of those units where someone will be moving into, or the bulk of the subsidy, and then the PSH provider. So whoever's going to have that tenant that will be transitioning in place or into a different unit, and then potentially the CoC as well. There are some MOU templates that are available for you. Those will be explored more in the resources module, but those are available on the website, and those don't include the CoC at this point, but if there was ever a need to include the CoC as a party of the MOU, then you could certainly add them in. And there's some components that you're going to want to make sure that you think through, such as, every MOU has roles and responsibilities. So specifically here, with regards to referral and eligibility, and what does that workflow kind of look like? You want to include data sharing and reporting expectations. What are partners trying to measure? what's the measure and the source? What's the time frame of this agreement? And then who's responsible for the transition or post-transition services, or those aftercare supports, as you'll hear them called as well. All of that should really spelled out, because if everyone thinks that everyone is doing everything without a clear delineation, then you run the risk of like nothing getting done, which could really be detrimental for the person that is transitioning. So there really needs to be a clear understanding of when one provider steps in and the other steps out, and who's the main point of contact when. Okay, this is a resource that's available to you. It's in the resources module. Also here you see it hyperlinked, and it's from the HUD Exchange. There's a ton of resources on the HUD Exchange for moving on. That's actually where we got most of the content for these modules, is what HUD has to offer. And here we have a moving on project plan template, which goes through each of the different components that we talked about earlier on a couple of slides ago, but then really let you map out who's doing what when and any relevant notes. There's the project plan tab, and then you'll see across the bottom there, this is actually a workbook, so there's different sheets across the bottom. So this is available to you to help you see exactly what you need to be thinking through and working on. Here we have another resource from the HUD Exchange. This is a screenshot of what it looks like, and this will be also available in the resources module, but the housing resources inventory. So looking at each of the different types of housing resources that are available to help support the individual that's moving on, and perhaps the type of subsidy that they might be able to receive when they're not receiving rental assistance anymore from PSH, or the type of unit that might be available. This really kind of helps it spread out so you could see what's what and what the available options are. Again, you can see it hyperlinked on the bottom so that you can access it easily. When you are filling that out, there's some prep work that you're going to want to do and look at. This is where that planning team, that core planning team, might come into play. You might want to just have like a community meeting with everyone at the table so that this can be discussed. But you're really looking at how many site-based and scattered site PSH unit that your community has. How many tenant-based permanent supportive housing units do you have? Are any of them LIHTC? Do you have any public housing units? How many housing choice vouchers are there in the community? Or other types of vouchers, potentially mainstream vouchers, things of that nature. Are there any homeless or moving on preferences at the local PHA? If not, that can be a larger conversation, and we have lots of guidance around how to have that conversation in the resources module, and then also in the modules for the PHA itself and for the PSH provider. And then what other affordable housing buildings or units exist within the community? So these are all the types of things that you're going to want to be looking at. And to the extent that DMA might be able to assist with this, we may have some stats that are readily available, especially as related to the CoC and Housing Authority units. So certainly always, you're more than welcome to reach out to DMA via the CoC's email address. So that's an option for you as well. Okay, and when we're talking about housing operators, that's really whoever is providing, that unit or that subsidy post PSH. And so we saw how there could be a number of them. And so this, again, will depend on the composition of your area. But PHAs like this cannot be like stated enough that they really play a fundamental role in moving on, providing access to housing choice vouchers and public housing units. Multifamily building operators also provide access to critical affordable housing options. And then those other affordable housing operators provide access to units that may be ideal for tenants within certain income bands. For example, a tenant may be income ineligible for a housing choice voucher, but they might be an ideal fit for a subsidized unit in a LIHTC property. So we talked about some of the core components of a successful move-on strategy. We've talked about some of the partnerships that are needed and, the makeup of that leadership team. But there's a couple of keys to success. So for one, you're going to want to gather partners and resources from multiple systems to break down barriers and help tenants move on from PSH. So we saw this exhibited with the variety across stakeholders that were suggested for that key leadership team. You're going to want to build strong cross-agency partnerships if they're not there already, and ensure coordination in planning, implementation, and outcomes tracking. Okay, communication is going to be key. You're going to want to use data, which can be desegregated by race and ethnicity, to measure progress and make changes as needed. And you are going to want to center input from people with lived expertise in all stages of the process. We do not want any kind of tokenism in this strategy or in the local processes, meaning that someone with lived experience and lived expertise is just there to check a box, and so that the community can say that they have incorporated that into their plan. The goal here is really to give folks with the lived expertise and experience true voice and decision-making ability at the table within your move-on strategy. Yes, providers know how to operate the programs to an extent, but these are the folks that have lived through the programs, and they know what works and what doesn't work from their perspective. So it's really imperative that they are also a part of whatever plan you begin to set up in your community. So once you have everyone at the table and you're ready to start delineating duties of exactly who's doing what, and really, taking the terms of the MOU seriously, this might help you kind of envision what it should look like in terms of who's doing what. So the CoC or other coordinating entity, maybe it will be the RAB. It really just kind of depends on how this plays out in your area. But there's going to be, training and interagency coordination, certified tenant eligibility for moving on according to the local criteria, outcomes and data reporting and data tracking. So that happens, at the CoC level. In some instances, the certifying tenant eligibility for moving on might happen more at the PSH level. It really will depend on the size of your move-on strategy and that geographic area. But then the PSH provider, they are going to support with documentation and housing applications. They are going to be the housing search support and landlord engagement as needed, especially if the person is not transitioning in place. The transition supports and aftercare or post-PSH care to promote stabilization and housing voucher retention. And then also data tracking. Housing authority or housing operator will be doing voucher application and intake. They'll have dedicated staff, potentially, hopefully, to expedite processing when possible, and then also data tracking on their end. So there's multiple levels of data tracking happening, likely all happening within HMIS. And there is actually a part of HMIS just for moving on, and there's a very brief module just to address that one portion of HMIS that you're going to want to know about. Okay, and then just as a really good general reference for you, which again, this will be highlighted in the references module, but there's a snaps in focus specifically on moving on. It's very brief. It's just a few pages, maybe 3 pages or so. And it does a really good job of explaining move on strategies. So this might be able to be used in a meeting when you are explaining this for the first time to someone, or as a recap, something you might want to pass on to other providers, let them know this is something that you're looking to introduce in the community, you know, just to kind of get people on the same page. But I would definitely recommend taking a look at this particular resource. And then finally, we have our email address here for your CoC at DMA. It's easterncoc@pennsylvaniacoc.org. You could shoot us any questions that you have about this. If you need help identifying who your partners are, other questions about the training, please don't hesitate to use this email. This wraps up your general overview. Most of what we talked about here, though, as I mentioned on the first or second slide, is looked at in greater detail in other modules. This was just meant to be a high-level overview. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another module.